Welcome to Fertility Friendly Food, the podcast. My name is Stephanie Vlakis and I'm an expert certified fertility dietitian and nutritionist and founder of The Dietologist, a multiple award-winning virtual fertility and pregnancy nutrition clinic serving thousands from around the world, and of course, the host of this pod, Fertility Friendly Food. This podcast is dedicated to all things health and nutrition in the world of fertility, reproductive health, and pregnancy. Each week, I bring you practical snack-sized episodes to help improve your lifestyle on your trying to conceive journey, alongside guest expert interviews to help inspire you to learn and grow whilst you grow your family. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Fertility Friendly Food. Today's episode is a bit of a follow-up episode off the back of our previous one with our special guest, Sarah King, all about hypothalamic amenorrhea. We will leave a link to the show notes for you to that previous episode to get the 411 on what is HA. But just to give you a quick bit of context for those who don't know, hypothalamic amenorrhea is a loss of your menstrual cycle, typically due to an energy deficit of some kind, whether that be caused by undereating, overexercising, or chronic stress, or a combination of a few of those things. Obviously, no ovulation and no period means no opportunity to get pregnant without assistance. So restoring ovulation and your menstrual cycle is so critical if you are aiming to conceive without medical intervention. So we are getting Sarah back on the potty today, who is not only an incredible colleague of mine, and who I regularly collaborate with on client care, but she's also my beautiful friend. So this time we are talking about HA and focusing on some of the practicalities that you can make to help restore your period. So welcome back to the podcast, Sarah.
Hello, I'm so excited to be chatting with you. Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Always good to chat. So for those who are new here or who don't know you, give us your intro.
So I am an accredited exercise physiologist by occupation and also a health coach. I specialize in assisting women specifically who have hypothalamic amenorrhea or who have struggled with disordered eating or an eating disorder to regain their menstrual cycles and make sure that they are healthy and regular, to conceive naturally if that's something that they want for themselves, or to simply optimize their hormonal well-being, which we know is a huge, critical, important part of our overall health. And then alongside that, having a healthy relationship with food and exercise so we can have healthy, happy, long lives. That is the long and the short of everything that I do.
Just, minor work.
Minor work. Yeah, out here helping people live happier, healthier lives, making babies. It's great.
Saving their bones from osteoporosis, saving their hearts, all sorts of things.
Exactly.
So a common question I get a lot in my DMs about HA is what is HA and what it isn't? Because I think the definitions can sometimes be a little bit oversimplified or doesn't quite encapsulate the full spectrum of people who may be impacted by HA. I think a lot of people pigeonhole it into only people that have an eating disorder, or only people who are underweight, or only people who are athletes. So can you tell us a little bit more about what is HA and what it isn't?
So, like you mentioned before, hypothalamic amenorrhea is a form of secondary amenorrhea. And that means people have had a period at some point in their lives that's naturally occurred. So their body has produced that menstrual cycle. So not from the oral contraceptive pill. And then it has gone missing for 3 months or greater. Now, getting a diagnosis of hypothalamic amenorrhea is a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that we have to rule out any other potential causes of a missing period. Now, the one that often gets misconstrued with HA is PCOS. And obviously, we're not going to go into the ins and outs of that, but PCOS can cause irregular cycles or missing cycles. But the root cause of the hypothalamic amenorrhea is very, very different. And it can happen to a person at any body size. And I think that's so important to reinforce. It's not something that just happens to people that might have a history of disordered eating or are athletes. It can happen to someone that is recreationally active. It can happen for someone for whom maybe they have had an eating disorder and their treatment team has said, oh, you're quote unquote weight restored, but their periods haven't returned. It can happen to someone that might have, I guess, what we would consider a disordered eating pattern that might be, I guess, not necessarily always thought of as one that might cause HA, like binge restricting. So people might be like, oh, but I'm eating such a big, I guess, surplus of energy sporadically. But the stress that it causes on your body when you're having those periods of restriction can have a huge impact. And the missing period is kind of just the like red flag warning sign, because there are so many other things that happen to a person's body when their body isn't receiving enough energy and getting a period. So you kind of alluded to those before: heart issues, issues with their bones, issues with digestion, mood disruption and dysregulation. So even though the missing period is the thing that people notice the most, isn't the full picture of what is happening within a person's body and for a person when they have hypothalamic amenorrhea.
I think that myth about it only affecting people with an eating disorder or a history of an eating disorder, or only people in a smaller body, is so pervasive, and I think is such a barrier to adequate diagnosis and identification. And in that last episode we recorded, we did talk a lot about the crossover between PCOS and HA and how to untangle that. So I will say it again. We'll leave the link in the show notes to that previous episode that we did with Sarah. So we will park that part of the conversation for the time being. I can distinctly recall a particular client of mine a number of years ago who did have a diagnosis of PCOS. And she restricted her diet so significantly. And at first, she thought that she was doing the right thing by her PCOS, by quote unquote losing weight. That seems to be the magic bullet solution for everybody with PCOS. If you don't sense my sarcasm by now, that is not necessarily true in all cases. And so she restricted so much that she ended up then losing ovulation, losing her menstrual cycle, because of how inadequate her energy intake was and how stressed she was. And she was absolutely overdoing it at the gym in terms of exercise. And so yeah, I think she transitioned from PCOS into HA because of her endeavors to try and manage her PCOS with her lifestyle were just so restrictive. And yeah, she couldn't really get her head around it at the time that could have happened. It must just be that PCOS is flared up, and so I should work harder at this. Yeah, that was a really important piece of the puzzle for her, is to actually help her see that liberalizing her diet and eating more and exercising less was actually going to be the thing that helped her got her period and ovulation back.
Yeah.
It was a tricky one. I will never forget her face when I suggested it. It was just such a wild thought to even be proposed. As dietitians,
Keep going. I was just going to say, I've had the same thing happen, because sometimes people recover from hypothalamic amenorrhea and then kind of have this like PCOS, I guess, appearance and symptoms that can pop up like for the 12 months after their periods come back. And so there is this crossover, and you can have both, and you have to manage obviously getting your cycles back first before you dive into the PCOS management side of things, because for most people PCOS is like very irregular cycles, not normally the complete absence of them altogether, but it does vary from case to case.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. As a dietitian, I typically see a lot of people delay getting support for HA, because I think on paper, the quote unquote solution to HA is in theory quite simple: eat more, move less, manage your stress. It seems very like reductionist, obviously, and it is. But the reality is, whilst the management strategies are theoretically simple, the implementation of these is extremely complex, What are some of the biggest barriers that you see that people with HA face when it comes to changing their lifestyle to recover their period?
I would say the single biggest barrier is the fear of weight gain. And I guess in if we go into that a little bit more, it's probably that the fear will be that their weight exponentially increases and that weight gain never stops. And it's also what that different body size means about them. So, body image issues and fear of weight gain would be a huge barrier that I see in clinic every single day. Alternatively to this, and sometimes they coincide together, it's kind of, I guess, the obstacle of not wanting to give up exercise because exercise is seen as something that's healthy and maybe they identify closely with what fitness means about them as a person. So their identity gets really wrapped up in being someone that does X number of gym sessions or runs or whatever they do, or maybe it's even, part of their work. So I see a lot of people that work in the fitness industry and the health industry. What am I going to be thought of if I don't do as much as I'm currently doing now? So that fear of judgment, both of oneself and from others, is a huge one. And I think because it requires a lot of lifestyle changes simultaneously, people are worried that they won't be able to cope because they've been using all of these strategies, maybe around controlling the way that they eat or eating a very routine way. Similarly with exercise, that if they don't have those things available to them, that they won't be able to manage their stress or cope or live a fulfilling life. Now those are just a few because the list is endless, but those are the most common that I see.
Yeah. What do you think is at the heart of a lot of those struggles that people that have HA face in terms of making that change? Is it diet culture, body image, the eating disorder of in and of itself, whether it's clinically diagnosed or not? Is it habitual? Is it, like you said, the fear of weight gain, which links into that body image and diet culture piece? Or are those factors unique to each individual?
I think the factors are unique to each person. Similarly, like if we look at why disordered eating or eating disorders might occur, sometimes it's oversimplified as just something about aesthetics or bodies and that over evaluation of weight and shape. But for a lot of people, it isn't. And it's similar with hypothalamic amenorrhea. You might have just wanted to adopt a healthier lifestyle and followed advice that we read and see online about what quote unquote healthy eating and exercise looks like. But we've unintentionally put ourselves into this energy debt and didn't know that this could be a possible outcome. It could be this illusion of control that, I guess, eating a certain way or exercising a certain way gives us. And I find that that control element combined with kind of perfectionist tendencies tend to be a common thread amongst people that have hypothalamic amenorrhea. And that might just be a personality trait. It might be something that has, I guess, benefited them in other ways in their life. And it's kind of melded into how they eat and exercise. But there are so many unique factors, obviously, diet culture being a big one. But it would be remiss of me to say that it's definitely just one thing.
Mm. Yeah, I think that oversimplification of eating disorders is a huge one. Like, often when I talk to other people, and typically it's not in the context of colleagues, it's usually like more in my personal life. Like, if I say, oh, it's really challenging working with eating disorders, and not in a like burdensome way to your practitioner, not in that sense, but just the nature of the way that eating disorders work are challenging. And I think people then, the responses then I often get is like, oh, well, why can't they just eat more? Or why can't they just stop? Or, and I've always find it so hard to articulate A lot of my clients will often say, I feel like I'm caught in a prison of my own mind. I know logically what I need and have to do, but I just can't seem to do it. How do we build that bridge for people between that logical part of their brain, which may not be firing on all cylinders if they've been restricting, to that making a change part? Because I think that disconnect is that's where people need help.
And you are 100% correct. I think so much of what we see in terms of advice is just do the opposite of what you've been doing, and then you'll recover your period, recover from your eating disorder. And so it really rides on the fact that there's this assumption that our logical brain is what drives our decision making and our behaviors. And that's not actually the case. We are emotional beings who then have logical outcomes as a result of that emotion. So I'll give you this analogy. Most people think that if they want to drive to a destination or an outcome, right? Maybe that outcome is recovering your period. Maybe that outcome is expanding your variety of foods in eating disorder recovery. Maybe that is adjusting your exercise intake, whatever that is. Imagine you jump in the car and you sit behind a steering wheel. Most of us assume that our logical brain is behind the steering wheel and our emotional brain is in the passenger seat along for the ride. And that's how we get to where we want to be. What is actually the case is the reverse. It is our emotional brain that sits in the driver's seat, and our logical brain has to talk to our emotional brain to direct it to where it wants to be. So, the bridge between what we know we need to do and actually doing it is this aspect of kind of emotional regulation and distress tolerance. We have to get better at understanding what purpose does that behavior serve and how long has it been there, because it's both habitual and also has given us kind of some aspect of coping or way of being for a very long time that has served some greater purpose, right? It may no longer serve its original intended purpose, but that's why it kind of was once developed. And we have to be curious with it. And when we are providing solutions on behavior change, that's where we actually have to dive into the emotional side and ask a person, what kind of thoughts and feelings do you think will come up when you do this? What kind of urges do you think you'll experience? What sensations might come up for you? How do you make space for that, knowing that that might be an actual outcome of doing the thing that you know will help you? And how do you sit with it? And sitting with it might not be like, a Zen master doing 15 minutes of meditation like we think it might be, but it's like, how do you have healthy ways of gentle distraction? How do you gently plan around that situation so that you don't compensate? And all of those make this process so intricate and timely and sometimes incredibly challenging because, like you said, it's not just as simple as eat more or stop moving so much. It is, but it's more complex on the emotional side that we have to provide the brain a safety net when we do those new things to reassure it that it will be okay with these new behaviors.
Yeah. As a dietitian, obviously, I'm advising mostly on the food front. And we use the RAIDS model typically when we're working towards building an adequate and variety filled diet. And so, for those who don't know what RAVE stands for regularity. So, are you eating regularly enough? Times in which you're eating and how they're spaced. Adequacy, are you eating enough at those meal occasions? Variety. And then we've got spontaneity and eating with flexibility and all those kinds of more that socialization eating. And I find that regularity can even just take sometimes months of work to get someone to go from X number of meal occasions a day to Y number of meal occasions per day, more in line with what we would anticipate would actually be adequate to meet requirements. So I think there's an oversimplification. And I also think typically, and this is a very big generalization, but the personality types of people that have HA have a very individualistic mentality of I can do this, because they are quite disciplined and they are good at following rules. And in fact, they enjoy following rules. And so, oh, well, it's just a new set of rules I need to follow, fine. But there are so many unexpected roadblocks that people then end up facing that delay, detour their path. And when it comes to trying to conceive in fertility and pregnancy, that's often then a biological pressure, whether it be age related or just of desire, that starts to creep in. And so then you've got this very unique situation of, I need to follow this new set of rules. It's really, really hard, but I know I need to if I want to have a baby, or I know I need to be healthy in this pregnancy. And then that's creating stress and feeding into that loop as well. So it's just this perfect storm moment, I often find, when it comes to somebody who wants to recover their period from HA, who then wants to try to conceive or has been trying to conceive. I guess wanted to get that off my chest in the first instance. But what are some of those practical things that you find work really well from a nutrition perspective, from an exercise perspective, from a stress perspective for your clients when it comes to HA management, especially in light of trying to conceive?
Yeah. And to touch on your point, I think one of the ironic things about recovering from hypothalamic amenorrhea is we're obviously trying to manage stress. And like you said, the stress of trying to recover can be stressful in itself. So we have to be really mindful of, number one, not piling on every single change all at once if we don't think those changes are going to be sustainable. So, from a nutrition perspective, I, similarly to you, use the RAVES model. I think it's a really great way to take a person from a stage of like mechanical eating, which is what is really necessary in those first instances to give the body enough energy, towards more intuitive eating when we start incorporating eating socially and spontaneity down the track. Now, I don't want to give quote unquote rules that anyone listening to this could then kind of latch onto and run with. So I'm going to give you the guideline of threes, which is a really helpful nutrition perspective to start with. So you'll often hear this term like the quote unquote rule of threes. I'm going to make it the guideline of threes because it's not set in stone. So that refers to 3 meals, 3 snacks, eating roughly every 3 hours. As a minimum, never a maximum, because different people will need different numbers of meals, and also within those meal and other eating occasions, you will need different amounts of energy based on your own unique body and its needs. So that's where I would start with. When you're looking at those individual meals, you want to make sure that you're getting all of your macronutrients in those meals. So a mix of your carbohydrates, your healthy fats, your protein, plus some color. So those are things like your veggies, your fruits. And I think one of the things people might think about is like, oh, okay, well, I do that now. I might be having like brown rice and chicken and broccoli, right? So I'm like ticking all those boxes. But we really want to make it a really nourishing meal. So could you use chicken thighs instead of chicken breasts? Could you change the proportion of how much rice that you have on your plate versus how much might be filled with lots of veggies? If you are having veggies, are we making sure that they are roasted or sauteed in oil, or you have an added dressing? So all of those things make a huge, huge difference. And while a meal might look visually similar, one might be much more nourishing for your period recovery journey. Then at your snack occasions, I always say at least 2 of your macronutrients at each snack occasion. So a handful of almonds is not going to do it. You need much, much more when you are working on period recovery, because your energy needs are just going to be so much higher, because we're trying to put you in a caloric surplus to make that hypothalamus in your brain go, yep, Safe to create a baby, let's switch those hormones back up and create a menstrual cycle. So that's where I would start on that nutrition side of things, and really getting like really working with a health professional on how it's going to fit into your life. You know, there's millions of like cookie cutter approaches out there on the internet, but they don't take into account what your life looks like. So that's where individualized support becomes so incredibly helpful. Now, if we flip over to the exercise side of things, this one is also tricky because every single person will be able to tolerate a different amount of movement in their recovery journey. Now, I guess if you're thinking about what is going to be the best approach to movement when you're working on period recovery, the truth is the least amount of movement is going to be the best. And this comes from someone who knows so much about the physiology and the benefits of exercise. We love exercise, but you're not actually gaining many of that benefit when your body is undernourished, when it's not functioning optimally as it is during hypothalamic amenorrhea. So, if you want to go for gentle walks, gentle yoga, gentle Pilates, and you do that a few times a week, that is a fine thing to do. If you're forcing yourself to work out every day, that is not something that I would recommend. So,
And the intent, sorry to butt in there, but the intention behind the movement is what I find is even almost more important than the movement itself, because if the intention behind the movement is to try and compensate for the changes in the eating plan, that's the red flags from a practitioner perspective of like, ding, 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 something needs to change here.
yeah,
Yeah.
I 100% agree. Like similarly to like nutrition, I care a lot less about the actual specific things a person eats and much more around kind of their relationship with those foods. Similar, it's very similar with exercise. And I think one of the other things that often catches people out is they think to themselves like, oh, but I'm just doing lower intensity movement now, or like, oh, I'm just going for some walks. And they don't realize the impact of those on their energy expenditure and on their bodies in this state of having hypothalamic amenorrhea, which it's super difficult to give up something that might be a source of stress relief for you or something that you genuinely enjoy. But it is a short term pause on those things, and it will reset your relationship with exercise so much if you allow yourself to work on those things as much as you're working on your relationship with food.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about the stress management piece?
I often find the stress management piece is less about adding more things in and more about taking things off of people's plate. I often find that people are like, what can I do? What can I do? What can I add? And I'm often going, what can you take out? Because a lot of times I find that many of my clients who have HA are like always on the go, always doing things, always being like really, really productive. And they are high achievers, which is fantastic. But actually, their body just needs quiet moments, rest, and relaxation. So, some of the things I try and help my clients build into their week is like more white space, more downtime, and not necessarily saying like, oh, you must meditate for 20 minutes, but asking them, what do you find stress relieving? Is it reading a book? Is it sitting outside in the sunshine? Is it having more time to play with your dog or be with your family? And that is what we prioritize as a form of stress management. And obviously, adding in all of those, I guess, proactive stress management tools like breath work, meditation, journaling, getting good sleep is probably the number one. Yeah, the number one recommend. Like I often start with lifestyle changes as like changing people's sleep patterns, which they think is very strange. But getting enough sleep is the number one way to kind of like help manage your stress a little bit too. So all of those things, but yeah, taking things off your plate is often not the kind of advice that you would hear, but actually I find makes the biggest impact for people.
Oh, totally. And I've had to have those conversations with people too in so many contexts of like, so what's next? And I'm like, there isn't always a what's next. Sometimes You just keep doing what you're doing. And I think there is this part in HA recovery where implement the things that need to be done that we know will work, but we need to give it enough time to take effect. And I think that, like what you said, that distress tolerance and tolerating discomfort is such an important skill to build, because there is a time in HA where you just have to maintain exactly what you're doing for a number of months before you start to see the outcome. And the first sign of your period, you don't just snap back like a rubber band to where you were before. And I think that that's another important thing, is that these are not changes. And I always say that from a fertility nutrition perspective all the time. I'm like, I'm not talking about this stuff that the day that you get a positive pregnancy test, that out the window, all this goes, So actually trying to build sustainable habits that are going to carry you forward and prevent this occurring again, because there is that anxiety for a lot of people with HA of the recurrence and avoiding that as well. So I guess for those people that perhaps have had HA or have HA and are worried about taking that next step, what's your words of wisdom to those listening?
From someone who has been through the process of recovery themselves, I don't ever think there is a perfect moment. And it is really just about kind of going, this is never going to be easy, but allowing it to persist for months or years longer is only going to have more detrimental impacts on your health and your well-being. And the anticipatory anxiety of making these changes is always 10 times worse than the actual changes themselves. I find so often and this was my own experience, but also with my clients, that the anxiety and assumptions that we have about what will happen as a result of these changes is far worse than the actual reality of implementing these changes and what actually happens. I find people have this realization that actually they feel so much better, that their lives become exponentially richer, that they feel so much more calm and at peace. Even though the initial changes were hard, the resounding feedback that I get and that I experienced was that it is so exponentially better to live as a person that has a regular menstrual cycle, because your body feels so much better and your life is so much richer. So don't put it off. As much as it is hard to take that first step, you will gain so much of your life and your health back by pursuing the necessary changes to get your period back and to optimize your health and your fertility.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. What you just said just took me back to something a client of mine said to me recently, and she's recovering from an eating disorder and in anticipation of IVF. And she said to me, she said, I know I need to do this. Yes, for me, but I don't want to model this behavior to my child and for them to think that it's normal, because it's not. And I just thought, oh God, that was so powerful. Like I was just like, yeah, because if you long-term listener to this podcast, or you know that I talk a lot about the intergenerational impact of nutrition from a fertility perspective, from a pregnancy perspective, but that intergenerational impact extends beyond just what you eat. It extends to how you relate to food, how you talk about your body, how your child watches you engage in exercise. If you have a parent that chronically diets, you are far more likely to also chronically diet. And so I think that part for so many people, if they think back to their own childhood or their own, or maybe a friend or somebody in their family, and they just go, oh yeah, that's so miserable, I don't want a future child to be part of that, then let that be your North Star for the time being. If that has to be something removed from you. I mean, in an ideal world, it's just about you, yourself, and I, and that's the ideal. But something to grasp onto to help you propel and take that first step forward. And you're right, the first step of seeking help is probably the hardest of all. but finding the right people like yourself is obviously a very key component of making life a little bit easier. So on that note, can you let us know where people can find you, connect with you, get support with you?
Yes. So I am active across social media. You can find me on all platforms. So Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Sarah Liz King. So just my name. And my website is the same, sarahlizking.com. So you'll find links to all the different ways to work with me, the courses that I have, etc.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your time and expertise and wisdom. I love talking to you, and I hope that this episode provided some practical insights and starting to bridge that disconnect for those of you with HA. If you know someone with HA that would benefit from this episode, please share it with them. I think that would be such a lovely gesture and a great way to share some evidence-based information and insights with them, and leave us a 5-star rating and review, obviously, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And we will catch you in the next episode. Bye, everyone. Are you currently trying to conceive, or are you on a fertility journey? If so, you can feel like there are 101 things you could or should be doing when it comes to your preconception or fertility health. It's easy to get overwhelmed really quickly. This is exactly why we created our preconception lifestyle checklist. It's 1 page for you and 1 page for your partner, categorized into supplements, diet, lifestyle, and environmental factors, and we focus on the low-hanging fruit. These are simple but effective strategies known to help improve your health and well-being for fertility, and also for a healthy pregnancy and a healthy baby too. Over 5,000 people have downloaded it already. Do you want your free copy too? Head to the link in the show notes now to swipe your free checklist. Okay, let's get into today's episode. Fertility Friendly Food, the podcast, acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognises the continuing connections to lands, waters, and community. We pay our respects to First Nation cultures and to the elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people tuning in today. This podcast is recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the